We got a short one today with 4.3.1, Diplomacy and Conflict on the American Frontier. So we're looking at some early examples of how the United States was beginning to expand, both gaining more land and moving into the land that we already had claims upon, and how that was achieved both through diplomatic efforts, so peace treaties and the like, and also conflict, so that's conflict with European powers who had claims on the land, and of course the real owners of the land, the Native Americans. So we're going to focus on that. Just 2 slides to go. So first of all, we have to look at those examples of diplomacy and also the conflict with European powers. So let's look at some diplomacy first. One of the biggest things that changed sort of our access and claims to what is the United States today was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. I mentioned it before in the last historical period, but only briefly because it's actually within this historical period and not the other one. That was in 1803, and the way that worked is the U.S. bought French claims in North America. So the French had actually lost all their claims to the land that was the Louisiana Purchase back in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. But when Napoleon came to power, he reasserted claims to land that the French Revolution had ceded to Britain and just said, you know, we're abandoning our colonies as well. We bought that from Napoleon, but what we were really buying was the claim to the land, not really the land itself. Now, if you looked at the land right there, you can see it pretty much doubles the size of the United States from what we had before. Now, of that land we had before, only about 10% of it was actually being occupied by Americans. So, did we really need all this land? Not really, but Thomas Jefferson looked at the price for it and said, that's too good to pass up, and bought it while he had the opportunity. Now, what that leads to is the need to look at what was actually in that land. So, Jefferson sent his old friends from the Revolutionary War, Lewis and Clark, to explore this land, to have kind of this expedition to just see what it was there. They bought the land having no idea what could even be there. Okay, there was no record, no journals, no studies of what they would encounter. I mean, they assumed they would encounter Native Americans and a lot of new terrain that they hadn't seen before, but they needed to see what it was like. So that expedition took about 2 to 3 years to get all the way to the Pacific coast and back, and report what was there. Okay, what was I going to say? Okay, so some things they discovered there. They were actually looking for a northwest passage to the Pacific Ocean over the Rocky Mountains. They were hoping that there was going to be some easy way to get through that huge geographical feature. Turns out there wasn't, so it wasn't as necessary as easy as they thought it was going to be. All right, so another element that really opened up the interior of America to actually use by the United States was a war, the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 actually goes from 1812 to 1815, and it was between the United States and Great Britain. Now, it begins with a few problems, okay? Now, all the way back from Jay's Treaty, we made this deal with Britain that they would stop impressing our sailors. Well, they didn't, okay? They kept on boarding U.S. ships, claiming that Americans were actually from the British Navy, taking them and forcing them to join the British Navy. Now, this continued to be a problem all the way up to the War of 1812. Other things going on is that the British were still occupying forts on American soil that they had since colonial times, and while they were in those forts, they were arming the natives to fight against American settlers. So, all these things were building up, eventually leading to another war with Britain. There were 2 sides there. The war hawks were calling for war with Britain. The doves, they wanted peace. So we still kind of use those terms today. This is one of the origins of those terms. Okay, Federalists, the Federalist Party, they were still around barely. They opposed the war. Okay, and they said they opposed the war so much that they were going to call for the secession of New England from the United States. Now, this was a very radical view, and it led to the death of the Federalist Party. So after the War of 1812, so over in 1815, the Federalist Party ceases to really have any power in government, aside from those that were already there before the party died out, like John Marshall in the Supreme Court. Now, long story short, the war was an utter failure. Okay, now what happened is we tried to take parts of Canada. We were always trying to take parts of Canada. We were trying to assert our control, and we actually thought it would work for us because the British were fighting off Napoleon in Europe as well. Turns out the British, we were kind of like, a fly buzzing around them, but they sent enough troops to make things difficult for us. They burned down our new capital of Washington, D.C. The White House was burnt down, the Capitol was burnt down, and then they had to be rebuilt after that. So what happens in 1815? We signed the Treaty of Ghent. Ghent is in Belgium. Why are we in Belgium? Well, Napoleon and Britain are at war, so we can't have the treaty in Paris, right? Always the Treaty of Paris. Not this time. So we negotiate the end. It basically reestablishes the status quo. The British agree again to stop impressing our sailors, to vacate their forts. This time they actually do those things, and this begins an era where we start to look at Britain as more of an ally economically and politically, rather than this this old power that we had beef with from the Revolutionary War. Okay, now, so the war is over, but news traveled slowly. So back in the United States, the war kept on going on. And this happened at the Battle of New Orleans. It was a huge American victory. It is one of the things that rose Andrew Jackson to prominence. That's how he became a war hero. But the treaty had been signed 2 weeks before. It took a couple months to get across the Atlantic, so the war was over. This battle probably would have won the war for us, and we could have got more out of the treaty, but it was settled, so it didn't matter. All right, so that war kind of resolves our issues with Britain, and now we can move forward with moving into that territory without British intrusion, and in the Louisiana Purchase without French intrusion. These two events get rid of other European powers in the Western Hemisphere. Now, something that was created in the same era that looked to enforce keeping Europe out of America was called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, it's named after the president at the time, James Monroe, who was in power during that era of good feelings. So, with all these precedents of getting Europe out, we needed a rule that said if Europe continues to try to intrude, they're going to have to mess with us and deal with us as an enemy. So, the doctrine says that America will stay out of European business, so Napoleonic Wars, any wars between Europe, not our business. The Monroe Doctrine very much goes in line with what George Washington was saying in his farewell address. It also says, though, that in return, Europe needs to stop colonizing the Americas. That means that if colonies in the Americas want to be independent, then Europe should just let them become so. And if they try to intrude and kind of try to enforce laws the way Britain tried to enforce more taxes and laws on us in our Revolutionary War, America would have something to say about it. Now, something important about this says Europe stay out of independence movements in the Americas. It does not say America stay out. So this is going to be an issue later on when we start to violate the sovereignty of these new nations, but we were not technically violating the Monroe Doctrine. Another way, diplomacy, the Adams-Onis Treaty. This just finalizes the purchase of Florida for us. So Spain had been in decline for a couple centuries at this point. Already many Americans were moving into Florida. After Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans, he kind of kept his men down there and started going through all the native tribes along the panhandle of Florida and killing them, fighting them, moving into Spanish Florida. So this finalized it. It already seemed like it was going this way years before. Another treaty, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Doesn't that just sound fascinating? No. It settled some minor border disputes with the United Kingdom. So those are happening up in Maine and up in Minnesota. Okay. You really don't need to know that one. It's pretty minor. But it's representative of using diplomacy to solve border disputes instead of wars like we see with the War of 1812. All right. Our last slide is going to be looking at what was going on with Indian removal and this idea of the frontier. Okay, so let me define the frontier for you. Frontier is the idea of where civilization stops. Actually, if you look at the French, in French they have the word frontière, which means border. Okay, it wasn't until I realized that I really understood what was meant by the frontier. I just assumed frontier meant this vast expanse of unsettled, unused land, and it means that, but more specifically, it's like you're on the border of where that starts and where civilization begins. Okay, now this border is pushed ever further west by settlers who keep on moving west, leading to conflict with Native Americans over land use. Now, as more Americans settle into these lands, there's a frontier identity that is developed. I've mentioned this before, this kind of idea of being a rugged American, having to live in the backwoods and deal with conflict with the natives. That's actually how Andrew Jackson grew up, so it was kind of a part of his very identity that leads to his views on Indian removal later on. This is the idea that helped him and President William Henry Harrison, the one that only served for about 30 days, gain notoriety and fame. They had this kind of log cabin appeal, that they were the common man, that they were one of these people living in the West, so they could easily win votes back there because they were not a notable, they were not some rich or elite person. Okay, so this identity is going to stick around with America all the way through Abraham Lincoln. I think that's where it ends. But this frontier identity is critical in the development of the America because it was helpful in sort of pushing Americans to want to pursue this American dream of being independent in that way, even if it meant kind of rugged living. Okay, so we have that identity developed, and that identity is going to come in direct conflict with native land rights. So this general topic is called Indian removal. And the way that we can begin it is in 1830 with an act of Congress called the Indian Removal Act. So this is when Andrew Jackson was president, and he wanted to move all Indians that lived east of the Mississippi River to areas west of the Mississippi River. So let's look at what he argued why it was a good thing. It wasn't a good thing, by the way. He said that it was going to be safer for both whites and natives. The way he looked at it is, he said, whether we like it or not, whites are moving into Indian land, and there is conflict. And the more whites that move further west, the more conflict there's going to be. So he said, let's sort of avoid this conflict by removing the Indians. Okay? So he kind of was brushing aside any sort of idea of native land rights, but he also wanted sort of the country to have less strife over the issue. So that sounds kind of okay. But here's the thing. He had a reputation as an Indian fighter. So he grew up right on the border of sort of Tennessee and the Carolinas. They all fight over where he's actually from and where he was born. So he grew up with people that had conflict with the natives. It's part of his identity. Once he became a general, he had a reputation for decimating many of these tribes that lived along the Florida Panhandle. That's how he built up his fame. So when we say that he wanted it to be safe for everyone, it's like, well, if we're looking at some ethos here, what is your reputation for your career? Not liking Indians. So it kind of sounds like he was trying to cover up what he was actually thinking. So, Indian Removal Act got through Congress, but just barely. I think it was in the Senate, it only got through by one vote, which means and shows you this was a contentious issue. Should the Indians be removed from their land? The Democrats were in power, and they made it happen. Okay, this would apply to what was called the 5 Civilized Tribes. So these were large tribes, ones that had taken steps to try and assimilate somewhat with American lifestyles. And oftentimes these were ones that made treaties and negotiations with the federal government. They were living in Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. Note, these are areas where more immigrants were looking to get land to grow cotton. So this wasn't an issue before because Americans weren't moving into that land. It is now an issue because Americans are moving into that land. Now, one of the best and one of the sort of saddest examples of how Indian removal happened had to do with the Cherokee, and it all came down to a Supreme Court case. I've mentioned the Cherokee before. They had the Treaty of Holston with the federal government all the way back from George Washington's time as president. Okay? And that said, they have a legal right to their land. They are a sovereign nation contained in the United States, and they have that right as long as they agree to assimilate and adapt to sort of an American way of life. So farming, no more being nomadic. And that's exactly what they did, and they were extremely successful and proved that assimilation was possible and that coexistence was possible. But now that they're on land that whites want, that doesn't matter anymore. Okay? So What eventually happened is their state made Indian codes that said that whites and Indians couldn't interact or live side by side. This guy, his name was, I forget his first name, last name was Worcester. He was a missionary that lived among the Cherokee, and he continued to do so. So he was arrested, and he took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court against the state of Georgia. So the Cherokee continued to fight against their removal. So what happens is John Marshall, enemy of Andrew Jackson, they hate each other, is still Chief Justice at the time. He's only Chief Justice for a couple more years, but he'd been there about 30 years. They hear the case, and the Supreme Court says that the Treaty of Holston is a binding contract with the federal government. Federal law is supreme to state law. Therefore, the Cherokee have the right to their land. Now, that doesn't mean that all the tribes had the right to their land, but it said the Cherokee did, okay, because they had a federal agreement that overrules any state laws. Okay, so SCOTUS means Supreme Court, by the way, says they can't be forcibly removed. It seemed like a victory for the Native Americans, but you've got a problem now of how the federal government works. Congress makes the laws, the Supreme Court interprets the laws. It is the executive branch, the president, who enforces the laws. So we now have a president with Jackson who does not want to enforce the law that has been ruled upon by the court. So there's the somewhat apocryphal story, but it would be nice to think it was true, of when Andrew Jackson heard the ruling. He didn't say it to John Marshall, but he just kind of said about the issue. John Marshall has made his ruling. Now he should go enforce it. He was joking because the Supreme Court has no power to enforce their rulings. The president does, and he basically said, I'm not going to enforce your ruling. So the removal process continues for the Cherokee and all tribes that lived east of the Mississippi. They had to move west of the Mississippi. Now with the Cherokee, the example of their removal is known as the Trail of Tears. Okay, so you can see kind of the maps of the removal that happened on the top right there. Most of the natives were moved to Oklahoma. So for a long time, when you look at maps, it'll have all these states sort of being created, and there's the shape of Oklahoma that says Indian Territory. Now that will eventually be revoked as well once people wanted to move into Oklahoma. White people wanted to move into Oklahoma. So we've got this long train of abuses against natives and their land rights that it seemed like treaties made, treaties broken, treaties made, treaties broken. Okay, that's why it was such a hotly contested issue, and really still is today with when you look at what's going on in the news kind of last year with the Dakota Pipeline and all that. Notice though, Trail of Tears didn't happen until after Jackson was president, so he made it all happen and then said peace and never had to do it himself, so he didn't look like he was the bad guy. His successor and vice president, Martin Van Buren, looked like the bad guy, and guess what? He didn't get reelected to another term. Okay, so Jackson leaves a giant mess and expects someone else to clean it up. Great guy, right? Alright, thank you so much for watching. There are your next steps, your terms, your geography, your quiz, your chronology, and subsequent videos. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you as always for watching, and I will see you in class. Bye.